Hi, everyone. My name's Fred Sutherland, and I'm so glad that you were able to find my presentation on the Munroe Turntable site that I gave at the Society for Industrial Archaeology Conference in 2024. I'm sure as you're watching here, you're just waiting to hear what is being said, uh, just as I was a short time ago when I believed, looking through the viewfinder of my camera, that I'd recorded entire segment of my presentation just to find out I hadn't turned on the audio. So, because I hadn't recorded the audio and several people have asked to see the presentation, I'm now going to show you the presentation slide by slide and narrate over it instead of just uploading a video of myself because I had to make more work. Yeah. Well, anyway, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're interested in what I have to share. And be ready to enjoy a story of a place that was lost and then rediscovered again. Well, to begin, this is not only my story, this is the story of many people and how this lost place was rediscovered again over 100 years after it had been lost to time. When I first heard about it, it had already been on the verge of rediscovery, let's say. But before I get into that story and the people involved, let me thank several key groups that made this entire endeavor over the last 4 years possible. First of all, the Legacy Amendment, a wonderful series of grants presented by the state of Minnesota to arts and cultural, environmental, and many other types of beneficial projects around the state. They've been very generous in supporting our work, both for the initial identification of this site in 2020 and the formal evaluation, which occurred last year in 2023. I would also like to thank the company which supplied the team of trained archaeologists that partnered with us. This would be Nenow Cultural Consultants, a St. Paul-based firm which has a very strong specialty in historical sites like this one. And lastly, I want to extend a very generous thanks to the Cass County Land Department, who've been gracious in allowing me to carry on investigations on their property, which is where this remarkable site is located. And they've been very responsive to my supportive feedback and how to manage and protect the site going forward. So thank you again for all your great work with that. And let's begin learning about where this place is located. What you see in the middle of Minnesota highlighted in red is Cass County. And we're going to be focused on the southern end of it, where in the late 19th century, a concerted effort began to harvest white pine timber and ship it further south to lumber mills to be processed into timbers for the rapidly building Midwestern United States. In particular, when we look at a more detailed map of where this logging railroad site is located, shown here in a yellow star, it was part of a much longer system of stops along a logging railroad route that extended from the southeast in Brainerd up to the northwest at Spider Lake. And Munroe served as a very important outer logistical hub so that any sort of train out on that extreme end of their line would be able to go to Munroe for service and maintenance and not have to travel all the way back south to Brainerd to get similar types of maintenance, and also just switching trains around. If you have more than one train on the line, you have to move one out of the way. And Munroe was a great place for that to occur. Now, unfortunately, The record of how this company operated is very limited, mostly to newspaper accounts, since the primary business records were lost in the 1920s in a fire in Brainerd. When this company completed their harvest in this section of line around 1893 or so, most of the tracks were pulled up and most of the camps were disassembled, and then the company, as it reorganized itself from financial challenges, then moved further north. And the line was more or less forgotten, except in those records, which, as I mentioned, were lost by the 1920s. So all that was left after that point were the stories handed down by local residents, one of whom was a man named Warren Huffman, kind of a local legend in himself. He was able to sort of embody the stories, the spirit, if you want, of the era in the 19th century when all of this logging and early European American settlement was happening. He was a very small child when the wildfire that happened, that blazed across the entire region there, occurred, including where his family was homesteading not too far from Munroe, and they barely escaped. And he remembered those stories and also inherited stories passed to him from other loggers who he worked with. And he then later passed on his knowledge and understanding of the past to a man called Doug Burke. Doug Burke is also a legend in the archaeological circles here in Minnesota. He was a master cartographer, an underwater archaeologist, a prolific scholar and researcher. And one of the things that he'd set out to do throughout much of his life was to rediscover these lost sites that were told to him when he was a younger man by Warren Huffman. And one of those was Munroe, because Warren Huffman had told him that there was some sort of turntable or roundabout or some other thing that was out there in the woods along the line, not just a typical camp. And what we see here is the moment where Doug Burke and Colin Swift, one of his close friends and assistants, was able to rediscover Munroe. And they did this finally in 2012, well, shortly after 2012, because of the publication of LiDAR data. And in this county, that means it's very detailed elevational data. And with that, armed with that 2012 LiDAR survey, they then were able to go out, I believe, in around 2014 or so, and ground truth what they saw was this big circular anomaly along what had been the former railroad line. And they were able to confirm on the ground, yes, indeed, this was not just a logging campsite or just a simple stop along the train line, but something much more. You see here, by the way, Colin actually standing within the turntable pit itself, which is approximately 40 feet in diameter. You're looking at some of the cross beams from that first day of discovery out there, or soon after then. And when the turntable was operating, the image you see next, this is actually taken further west, probably in California, but it represents pretty much what we believe that style of turntable would have looked like when it was complete. You could see those long timbers, both horizontal and some of the vertical as well, are probably what Colin was standing on when he was in the middle of that turntable. Now, I mentioned Doug Burke passed not long after the discovery of the Munroe turntable site, and he was unable to complete the identification survey and evaluation to know if it would be eligible to the National Register of Historic Places. And I've been told by his close friends and colleagues that he strongly believed it would be eligible, but just needed to be proven. And through those friends and colleagues of Doug Burke, I was approached to carry this project on to completion, which I've done so for the last 4 years. Beginning in 2020, the former logging railroad camp and the associated logistical hub for the railroad itself when we look at this map here, if you look to the southeast, that's probably where the line was initially built out. And you can see two fascinating sort of branching lines coming off of it. And talking with other railroad experts and people familiar with the local history, they've suggested that these were some early attempts to do basically what the turntable eventually succeeded in, which is to route both trains and engines on and off of the main line, either for servicing or to allow different sets of trains to pass one another. And clearly these early spurs or Ys were insufficient for the scale and pace of work that they wanted to do here. And so then they on their third attempt, the railroad company, invested in the turntable itself. And along with that, there was an attached engine shed with service pits. And those were all identified, mapped, and measured, along with an artifact scatter. And while we didn't collect any of the artifacts that we encountered, we did note where the artifact scatters dropped off. And that is essentially what defined the boundary that you see in red. The boundary you see in black is the extent that was walked in that survey. So in most places, we did explore beyond the limits of the artifact scatter, just to confirm that there were no additional features or groupings of artifacts that would be eligible for the site. Now, after we identified the site and got it on the state register, the next task was to lead an evaluation survey, something more intensive that required a lot more time and effort on the ground. And once the funding and support was secured in 2023, I was able to lead a team shown here, which was a mix of Neenah cultural consultant staff and some knowledgeable and enthusiastic volunteers who were very well briefed on the site, many of whom had worked with Doug Burke in the past. In particular, Colin Swift on the lower right, and the two other volunteers seen kneeling wearing blue hats are Brian and Becky Johnson. And in between them is NCC staff member Alex Hedquist. Along the back row in the yellow hat, we have Chris Rico. In the blue shirt, we have John Strott. In the center, we have Jeff Jones. And then in the gray shirt, holding my intrepid dog Bingley, is me, Fred Sutherland. And lastly, my adoring wife in blue shirt, Jessica. All right, this table you see in front of you represents the artifacts recovered during the 2023 evaluation excavation. Not surprising that the largest category are architectural items, things that were holding various structures together, whether they be industrial or habitation or part of the rail system itself. I would also like to call attention to the other category at the very bottom. I'll talk about some of the highlights with some of those middle categories as we go in the presentation. But in this bottom row, I wanted to mention that we did extensively sample charcoal for a very intentional reason. Wood was being burned as fuel both for the engines and to heat the structures at the camp. And also, it was the primary material that they were building structures with. And many of those wooden fragments of structures that were left behind became charcoal when they were burned by the wildfire that swept through shortly after the camp was abandoned. So knowing that, we extensively sampled the charcoal to identify the types of wood being used both for fuel and for structural elements on the site. Now, I won't be going into detail about that in this particular talk, but it did lead to some fascinating insights about the way they were selecting different kinds of wood for different purposes. The first area we surveyed in 2023 was in the turntable itself and the adjacent engine shed with its excavated service pits. They went underneath the engine so that they could access and repair things from underneath the engines on a platform. Now, these shovel tests revealed a lot of interesting material, and as you can see in this map very briefly, we just focused on the turntable and the engine shed. We didn't have enough time to explore every foundation, so this was really just trying to hit the highlight of the most important identified structures. The westernmost shovel test that we did in the engine shed area was along an embankment on the very outer edge of that engine shed, and we found a collection of tools that were laying against that bank. And here we're seeing several pieces of pipe, one of which seems to have been adapted into some sort of lantern that they could hang with a hook, potentially underneath the engines to provide some light while they were operating on various parts. And there's also a double bit axe head there, which I'll talk about a little bit further here in detail. Here we see the axe head once it was cleaned up, and what we'll notice just even to an untrained eye is that both edges don't look the same. The one edge on the left, I'll call it a bit, is heavily sharpened, and it doesn't really have its original shape or form. It's been very kind of reduced. This edge was known as a keen and was kept sharp so that they could cut portions of limbs and trees in ways that they didn't believe they were going to damage the edge. So this was being used just to cut into wood. Now, the edge on the right, the bit on the right, was called a stunt. And it was called that because this was the edge that they used to cut off limbs near the ground or trim things to where they might skip across a rock or something and damage the edge of the axe. So they always kept one edge sharp and one edge somewhat blunted or more roughly done so that they could do both kinds of work with the same axe head. That was the advantage of these double bit axes. They didn't need to switch tools for jobs like that. And here we see some additional artifacts that were recovered from the engine shed service pits. And these include personal items like clothing buckles, buttons, fabric rivets for working clothes, but also quite a large number of nails that showed signs of burning. And that's that bright cherry red color that you see on the surface that where it isn't rusting. That tells us that these nails were exposed to high temperatures from the flames of most likely the wildfire that burned through here shortly after the camp was abandoned, before these nails had time to rust. Once our survey with shovel testing confirmed some areas with high concentrations of artifacts and interesting features, we then decided to place units into the turntable itself, both on the outer edge and the central area where the pivot mechanism would have been. And the other area we turned our focus on was to the south and east, where we know that the main habitation area was, the bunkhouse and the mess hall. And we placed units in areas we figured were high traffic and would have had a lot of things that could have fallen out of people's pockets or been left behind the doorways. So the first unit that was excavated was along the outer rim of the turntable, and here we can see at the kind of center and lower left of that unit 3 remnants of wooden beams that were used to support probably a rail that would have helped balance the edge of that turntable as it rotated along a single line of track that it had along there. We also see different deposits of fill that were left behind inside the trench for this turntable. And we can especially see a fill deposit that's along the entire, well, from our point of view, top of the unit, which was probably an earthen ramp that was built as they were scrapping out the turntable and were ripping out all the mechanisms and parts that they wanted to salvage. The next unit, as I said, was placed in the center of the turntable, and we can see here a very shallow kind of deposit leading to a deeper central pit, and remnants of several beams that were left behind. There was also quite a bit of metal hardware recovered near the center, and I'll talk about one of those in just a second. One of the more significant fragments of metal that we found near the center of the turntable is this turnbuckle rod that we see here with the thread and the two hooked ends. This would have provided tension, which would help brace and support the deck and frame of the turntable, much like a bridge. And I'll show a picture of what that would have looked like in use. Here again we have the image from the early 20th century showing what we believe the turntable that was used at Munroe would have looked like when it was complete. And we have highlighted where the turnbuckle rod would have supplied tension and bracing to the frame of the turntable. This style would be known as a gallows turntable. And also we can notice again that the turntable was relatively balanced and easy enough to turn that even with the full weight of a steam engine on it, two people could effectively push and turn that engine around. After intensively investigating the turntable, we turned our attention south to the bunkhouse area. And in particular, we knew we had the front door to the bunkhouse because we found a wash basin. And through our research, we learned that this company preferred to have their workers clean themselves, wash their hands, wash their face before entering the front of the bunkhouse. And they did this at every single camp. We don't have a picture from Munroe, but we have photographs from some of the other camps. In particular, here I'm showing Camp 1 that had a wash basin right outside the front door. The wash basin outside of the bunkhouse, while a significant artifact and important to document, was also challenging because when we found it, it had a small sapling growing right through one end of it. And so to completely study it and document it would have meant if we tried to remove it, we would essentially be destroying it. So rather than rip the basin apart in order to get a better look at it, we used an emerging bit of technology called photogrammetry. And we did this using the features in an iPhone 10 LiDAR. And the right software, we were then able to attach it to a selfie stick and scan the entire surface of the basin, even from angles where we physically couldn't stand or look. And then we reburied the object and preserved it in place. One highlight of what we discovered inside the bunkhouse was the number of personal items that were located. So in addition to the buttons and clothing items like we saw in the engine shed, we also found hunting ammunition, personal defense ammunition, which would be that smaller caliber shell you see on the far left. And in the middle, we also found part of a brass gold-plated locket. We have been very fortunate to learn through the research done by historian Jeremy Jackson that we have a photographic collection taken about a year after Munroe was abandoned, but by the same logging railroad company, and many of the same workers, most likely, were photographed. And here at Stony Brook Station, we can actually see a row of men and young boys brandishing a couple rifles and a shotgun. So it makes sense that we would find ammunition in the bunkhouse like that. But also in the photograph, further over, we also were able to document that there were some women and even a young girl present at some of the areas where they lived. And lastly, we have these series of photographs because of the naturalist, the gentleman with the butterfly net on the far right of this last photograph. Along with all the other significant artifacts that we found across the site, one of the more important ones came from one of the logging steam engines. Here we're looking at part of a drive shaft that had cracked and split. I think this is the sleeve coupling in particular. And we learned this through a combination of research done by Jeremy Jackson and railroad historian Kurt Halbridge. Now, the reason this particular part was so important was that we knew from the history of this logging railroad that each of the steam engines that you see in this picture, shortly before they were used at Munroe, had been converted from narrow gauge about 3 foot and a little more in width, to standard gauge, which is 4 feet 8 inches and a half inch. This change in their width also increased the amount of torque or tension that the drive shafts would be under, as they were carrying more weight and taking as sharp a turn as they may have before, but now they've got a lot more things to wrestle with. So likely this drive shaft broke because it was never built to tolerate the types of work that it was being put under once it was converted to a standard gauge. Here we see a composite photo put together by Jeremy Jackson of one of the Lime-Mache bevel gear driven steam engines that worked at Munroe. On the right hand side is the drive shaft of that engine prior to its use at Munroe, and then another close-up image of that same engine later on after it had worked at Munroe, and there's noticeable difference in the look of that drive shaft. So it is quite possible that this is the train that had its drive shaft break at Munroe and left behind for us to find later on. This is a diagram with the part that we had discovered highlighted in red. These trains were selected by the logging railroad company because of their special drive shaft system, gear-driven shaft, because they could take very tight turns at very steep grades and haul a lot of material for their size. And clearly this part that we found was under a great deal of strain and pressure because they were loading their cars and carrying a lot more weight than it was originally designed for after that conversion. I want to thank all of you for listening and watching with me as I talk about this remarkable logging railroad site that was rediscovered about 100 years after it had been abandoned. And what we're looking at now is a composite 3D image taken by Kurt Haubrich of the turntable and engine shed service pits. So I'm hoping that this demonstrated to you, as much as it did to Doug Burke, that this is a remarkable place worthy for nomination to the National Register of Historic Places. And that is the goal I am setting out for this after we finish completing our reporting on the site. I want to try to nominate this, and I'll look to do that as a next step. Thank you all again, and hope to hear from you in the future.